It's a fact. Education is a right. This right is documented in the Millennium Development Goals, the Education for All Goals, and other international agreements. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, in conflict-affected and fragile states, we know that this right to education is not being realized. Globally, there are 58 million primary school-aged children out of school. More than half of these children live in conflict-affected states. 20 million adolescents who do not go to school live in areas marred by crisis. Education and the way it's implemented can reinforce, exacerbate, and prolong conflict. How? One example is history textbooks that perpetuate myths, stereotypes, or biases against certain groups. Another example might be refugee children learning in well-resourced refugee schools with good teachers, while host community children study outside with no teacher at all. Sometimes exclusion is exacerbated when education is provided only in a stable area of a country. Meanwhile, children in the conflict zone miss out on years of education. Tensions can arise when education program staff is hired from only one language, identity, or ethnic group. Alternatively, education can promote peace. It can strengthen people's abilities to disengage from fighting and to solve conflicts in peaceful ways. There are many ways this can be accomplished. For example, by supporting schools with a parent-teacher association that includes members on all sides of the conflict, or by encouraging teachers to use positive discipline, inclusive pedagogy, and unbiased curriculum in their classrooms. Education can be instrumental in developing skills for the next generation, like tolerance of differences among people and groups, and peaceful ways to solve problems. When education and other forms of humanitarian aid are provided in a participatory, transparent, equitable manner to groups on both sides of the conflict, this can also contribute to peace. As education actors, we agree that education is a right for all children. We know the right is not being realized for many children living in conflict-affected contexts. We also recognize that education can be a force for conflict or for peace, depending on its context. What can we do? We can provide conflict-sensitive education, which means we can take the following 3 steps. 1. Understand the conflict context by collecting and analyzing information about the conflict actors, dynamics, profile, and causes. 2. Analyze the two-way interaction between the conflict context and education programs and policies by asking questions like, if I hire teachers from only this language group, how will that impact the conflict? Or, if I hire this security firm associated with one faction of the conflict, how will that impact the community's perception of my agency's education work? 3. Act to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts of education programs and/or policies on conflict by ensuring that the content and delivery of education services do not increase tensions and violence. What are the strategies for ensuring conflict-sensitive education? Here are some practical strategies informed by the INEE Conflict Sensitive Education Pack and the INEE Minimum Standards. Firstly, assess and analyze the conflict context. Consider factors such as conflict dynamics, actors, profile, and causes before designing the program. Refer to the analysis of the context and conflict through the program cycle. Including a wide range of stakeholders in the conflict analysis will also ensure a diverse and accurate assessment. A diverse group of stakeholders in the education community would include women and men, girls and boys, parent-teacher associations, government officials, different ethnic, religious, or social groups, and so on. But collecting all that information isn't enough. Ensure that you carefully verify all the information that people tell you. Collect and analyze data separately for different genders and different ethnic or religious groups. Do the same for any other important groups related to the conflict, with an eye towards noticeable discrepancies between these groups. Utilize the information that was gained from the conflict analysis to inform and shape the education response strategy and programs design. Make sure that the program or policy objectives, the timing of the program, and the selection of beneficiaries reflect an understanding about the conflict's dynamics, actors, profile, and causes. Conflict-affected and fragile situations can be overwhelmingly complex. Although strengthening education programs and policies is the ultimate goal, take care to monitor and evaluate the intended and unintended consequence of your organization's actions. And as the program evolves and changes, evaluate how the policy or program has interacted with the conflict over time. Has your education program, policy, or actions unintentionally contributed to conflict? Keep community members informed and engaged at all stages of the program or policy cycle, all the way from assessment and design to implementation and evaluation. Examining if community members are being excluded from participation will help to identify potential grievances and triggers for conflict. Also, analyze whether the way the program mobilized and allocated resources may have impacted the relationship between education and conflict. Finally, efficient coordination is crucial to delivering on educational goals of the program or policy. Ask yourself, are education actors engaged in peace-building coordination mechanisms? Are they engaged in education coordination mechanisms? And do the mechanisms promote equitable and conflict-sensitive education? Through learning and incorporating strategies such as these, we can ensure that education programs and policies are conflict-sensitive. In conflict-affected and fragile states, inequitable access to education can often be a cause of conflict. Education reform in conflict-affected contexts is an opportunity to correct historic barriers that have held individuals and groups back for years. Access to safe and protective learning facilities can help affected people cope with their situation and establish normality in their lives. What are the strategies for ensuring conflict-sensitive education? Here are some practical strategies informed by the INEE Conflict Sensitive Education Pack and the INEE Minimum Standards. To promote equal access to education in a conflict-sensitive way, consider the following strategies. Support education programs and policies that make education accessible to everyone, including former child soldiers, internally displaced persons and refugees, host communities, speakers of different languages, and other excluded groups. Monitor and share information with beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries on activities that promote accessibility as well as information on program conflict interactions. Do this especially when supporting education for groups who were previously excluded. Remove barriers to access such as school fees, lack of documentation, or certifications earned in other countries. Consider education strategies that address barriers to access caused by a generalized culture of violence, such as gender-based and sexual violence, providing psychosocial support as necessary. In conflict-affected settings, schools are sometimes unsafe and can often become targets for recruitment of child soldiers or bases for armed groups. However, schooling can also provide for children's protection and well-being. Here are a few examples of ways to deliver conflict-sensitive and protective education. Work with a wide variety of different community members to implement education activities in a way that protects teachers, learners, and the school environment. Keep learning environments and the routes to them free from violence and occupation. Link the education site to providers of other social services like health, psychosocial, and legal, so that teachers can connect children to appropriate professionals through referrals. Distribute protective information to teachers, students, and parents, such as the location and avoidance of mined areas, how to identify unexploded ordnance, or announcements of expected violence escalation. Finally, what can be done to ensure that education facilities and services are delivered in a way that is conflict sensitive? Any response strategy should reflect the specific findings of the conflict analysis. Involve a wide range of different community members when making decisions about site location, construction, or restoration. Continually monitor community perceptions regarding construction to avoid unintended violent responses that arise from construction being perceived as favoring one group over another. In situations of generalized violence, consider the proximity and safe access for both males and females to learning environments, water points and latrines, and mark learning spaces with visible protective boundaries and clear signs. Establish the learning site as a protected environment through school and teacher codes of conduct and/or zones of peace. Access to education is only as meaningful as the quality of the teaching and learning process. However, teacher training, curricula, and learning assessments can increase tensions in conflict contexts. Here are some practical strategies informed by the INEE Minimum Standards and the INEE Conflict Sensitive Education Pack. A conflict-sensitive curriculum includes topics related to peace and avoids bias against any group. Topics related to peace may include critical thinking, human rights, citizenship education, non-violence, conflict prevention and resolution. To avoid bias, the curriculum should meet the learning needs of different groups, such as former child soldiers, older children, and speakers of non-dominant languages. These learning needs may include life skills, job-related skills, and language skills relevant to the local labour market and economy. An unbiased curriculum also equally represents the experiences of boys or girls and men or women, as well as members of different identity groups. Additionally, it challenges existing stereotypes, such as those about gender or people with disabilities. In a conflict-affected context, teacher training, professional development, and support can help create a more peaceful and respectful and civically minded society. Here are just a few examples of conflict-sensitive strategies for training processes, training content, and teacher support. Make teacher training opportunities available to both men and women and members of different identity groups, especially refugee and displaced teachers. For groups that were previously excluded from teacher training, provide relevant training that meets their needs. The relevant authorities should recognize the training. Conflict-sensitive teacher training content includes participatory methodologies, human rights, conflict dynamics and transformation, identity issues, responsible citizenship, reconciliation, nonviolent alternatives, and addressing negative historical memories. Conflict-sensitive training topics should be reinforced by continuous and consistent follow-up, such as peer tutoring, supervisor support, material distribution, and refresher training courses. The teaching and learning process can be a powerful tool of social transformation for conflict-affected communities. However, teaching methods can unintentionally perpetuate ideas and practices that contribute to conflict, such as prejudice and inequality. Here are a few examples of conflict-sensitive strategies for teachers. Use methods appropriate for and inclusive of all learners, including reintegrated child soldiers, internally displaced refugees, and speakers of other languages, particularly children of other nationalities. Talk with parents and community leaders to ensure approval of the learning content and teaching methods, and do not regard it as a challenge to their particular identity group. On an individual level, be a model in the classroom for non-violence, critical thinking, peaceful conflict resolution, and respect for different opinions. Finally, learning assessments can be a source of opportunity in conflict contexts or a tool of constraint. Here are some example strategies to make assessment of learning outcomes conflict sensitive. Make assessments fair and accessible to all learners through translation, eliminating bias towards any group. Make sure that every student can access exams wherever they live. Coordinate with the local Ministry of Education to ensure that assessment certificates from other countries are officially recognized. Conflict-sensitive teacher recruitment and selection is a key way to break down perpetuated inequalities and helps build trust between people and their government. However, if people are giving teaching jobs because they support certain political parties or other groups, the tensions between groups can be made even greater, triggering further violence. Here are some practical strategies informed by the INEE Minimum Standards and the INEE Conflict Sensitive Education Pack. Write non-discriminatory job descriptions and selection guidelines that include conflict-sensitive competencies. Select teachers and other education personnel in a transparent way based on job descriptions and conflict-sensitive competencies, taking into account community acceptance, gender, and diversity. Deploy teachers to all regions in a fair and transparent way, using incentive schemes, either through salary or non-monetary bonuses, to fill hardship positions in underserved areas. Inequitable conditions of work can also be a driver of conflict, especially in fragile contexts. Therefore, it is critical that strategies to address working conditions and pay are implemented in a conflict-sensitive manner. Any strategy should be informed by the findings of the local conflict analysis, especially the examination of local political and economic dynamics. Consider these conflict-sensitive strategies. Provide equitable pay and working conditions for teachers and education personnel from all regions and all social groups. This includes the local population, refugees, and internally displaced people. This prevents inconsistent and irregular pay that could cause discontent and conflict. Coordinate pay schemes and working conditions with the government, non-governmental organizations, education cluster, and teachers' unions with the aim of supporting a stable, long-term education system. Plan ahead for a smooth transition from a local to a national payroll system. This will avoid gaps in pay and related grievances that could lead to conflict. Support and supervision mechanisms for teachers and education personnel are vital for establishing an equitable and high-quality education labor force. Supporting teachers' professional development and meeting their needs helps stabilize the workforce and prevent grievances that may lead to conflict. Let's review a few conflict-sensitive strategies for each. Where local teachers are poorly trained or inexperienced, professional development plans and certification processes should be put in place to support them and advance their skills. Particular attention should be given to support teachers from social groups previously excluded from the workforce. Peer support programs can also provide psychosocial support, often beneficial for teachers working in challenging conflict contexts. Teachers should be supervised in a transparent and unbiased manner through appraisals based on the job description. Teachers, employers, and community education committees should agree on job descriptions and teacher codes of conduct. Both documents can be used as a framework to supervise teacher performance in a fair and participatory way. Coordinate supervision with parents and students to monitor grievances and ensure parents and students have the opportunity to provide feedback on the performance of teachers and education personnel. Finally, examine teachers' approaches to conflict sensitivity in the classroom during in-person supervision visits. A powerful way for education actors to help fulfill the universal human right of access to education is through policy formulation and implementation. Conflict-sensitive education policies promote social cohesion, national identities that appreciate diversity, neutral, equitable education delivery for all, and a respectful teaching and learning process and environment. How do you formulate education law and policy in a conflict-sensitive way? Here are some practical strategies informed by the INEE Minimum Standards and the INEE Conflict Sensitive Education Pack. Use the conflict analysis and an understanding of the relations between the education system and social, economic, political, security and environmental dynamics to inform the formulation of new policies. Link education policy to conflict-sensitive poverty reduction strategies, peace-building agreements, stabilization policies, economic recovery policies, youth employment policies, and social inclusion policies. Coordinate with a wide range of stakeholders, including marginalized groups and groups with grievances, to build consensus around new education policies. Continuously consult different groups to find out their opinions about new policies and adapt practices in light of these opinions. Develop policies and plans for the short, medium, and long term. This will ensure a gradual, progressive education transformation and the sustainability of immediate post-conflict service delivery gains. Planning and implementing new education policy in a conflict context must be done in a way that is sensitive to the interaction between education and conflict. Although specific plans will vary according to context, the overall aim of education policy implementation should be equal access to quality education for all, including refugees, displaced peoples, and disadvantaged groups. Here are a few strategies for planning and implementing policy in a conflict-sensitive way. Continuously update the conflict analysis and use the findings to inform education planning and implementation. Facilitate participatory national discussions that include people from diverse groups, ethnic, religious, social, age and gender. And actors, governmental, non-governmental, education, non-education, local, external, UN and other. The discussions should aim to develop conflict-sensitive ways of delivering education activities for everyone. Integrate the planning and implementation of educational activities with other national strategies, such as emergency response, poverty reduction and peace building, in order to ensure better coverage of neglected areas or groups. Expand the long-term planning capacity, monitoring and education regulation provided by non-government actors in order to promote sustainable education service delivery and avoid grievances due to gaps in service. Set education targets and future resource needs to achieve equitable access. Achieve this by disaggregating budget allocations, enrollments, and teacher deployments for regional, ethnic, and religious groups in order to show discrepancies. Continuously monitor the implementation of education to track grievances and meet the changing needs of different regions and social groups without discrimination.